It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Bill Butos. Bill is a professor of economics at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. His research interests include monetary theory and policy, business cycles, and the economics of science, and Austrian economics. And it's the economics of science that he'll be talking about this morning. Bill is also a faculty fellow at the New York University Austrian Economics Program, and he serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Private Enterprise. And by the way, that's the Journal of Private Enterprise is the publication of APE, the Association for Private Enterprise Education, that I mentioned on the opening night. That's a terrific journal, too. It's not available online, I don't think, but if you can get your hands on a copy, that's good. Bill has been coming to FEE for a long time. And I say this every year not to make him feel old, but just for you to understand how long his association with FEE goes back. The first time Bill was at FEE, I think I was about 2 or 3 years old. So he might tell you about that. But Bill has been a friend of FEE for a long, long time, and it's my pleasure to introduce him to you today. Bill Butos.
Hear me? All right? Sounds all right. Some years ago, Steve introduced me at the SDAE meetings for my giving a presidential address. And I remember this very well, Steve. He said, you know, I asked everybody, I did my research, I could never find anything about Bill Butos that was in any way untoward. He lived a straight and narrow life. And my reaction, of course, is, Steve, you didn't do your research. But thank you for the introduction all the same. It's great to be here, and it's true. Steve was probably 2 years old when I first came here, and I'll tell you stories later about that if you are interested. But I was more concerned today, of course, with talking about the economics of science. Let me just flip to my first slide here, and I couldn't have asked for a better foil for the comments I'd like to provide you with today than something that then President-elect Obama said about, in this case, climate change, global warming. And let me read it aloud, because this is really a fabulously revealing statement, I think. You can read it yourself. The science is beyond dispute, and the facts are clear. Well, I guess that means that if you have a question about the underlying scientific basis of global change or global warming, it must mean either you're an ideologue or you're stupid. All right? What's particularly revealing and telling about this is that we now have essentially perhaps the most powerful politician in the world telling us what the science ought to be. And I think if you, as I go along, I think, and I try to stretch out some of the history behind some of these issues, I hope you'll come away and thinking that this is a very dangerous sort of sentiment that we, as people who value liberty, need to think seriously about. Okay, so what do I want to do today? Oh, by the way, this is from a Cato petition, as you can see, that over 200 or so scientists, hard scientists, published or signed with that the set of remarks that they made below. Okay, so since that time, I understand the number of scientists who have signed on to this politician has probably doubled just since last spring when it was issued. Okay. What I'd like to do is, kind of talk to you a little bit about the economics of science from the perspective of Hayek and Polanyi, and also to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done in this area with a co-author who is, whose name I should tell you, Thomas McQuaid. He and I have been working in this area for the last few years, and he doesn't enjoy coming to conferences a whole lot. He's much more of a Muller likes to mull things over very, very carefully. But a lot of the things I'll be talking about here have been mentioned in our various publications, and in some cases updated since those publications. What I want to do is treat science from the point of view of an economist. Now, that is to suggest that I'm not here to inform you about scientific truth, hard science truth. I'm not interested particularly in that. Rather, what I am interested in is how economists look at the set of institutions and the kinds of interactions that occur within scientific communities. So this is kind of a project that kind of has a lot of different ramifications and is sort of interdisciplinary, that certainly draws very heavily on economics, draws a lot on institutional theory, and also on some sociology. What's the Austrian lineage in all of this? And I think the quick answer here is that Austrians, of course, are very interested in knowledge. And as you heard from Professor Kerzner yesterday, one of the major points of Kerzner's talks was to isolate the fact that we need a mechanism by which we can access knowledge. The knowledge has to be discovered and then used, and in the market system, of course, the entrepreneurial function is paramount to that whole mechanism. Well, I kind of like to broaden that point out a little bit and say that Austrians ought to be interested in not just the discovery of knowledge in terms of a market system, but also how is knowledge produced? What's the generation of knowledge dependent upon? And in this case, the economics of science slides very neatly and nicely into that kind of question. You know, here we have a body of some particular kind of knowledge. We're going to call it science. Okay? And the question is, under what circumstances does that knowledge get generated? Okay? Now, we're not interested in the nuts and bolts of scientific research, as I tried to suggest earlier, but rather, what are the institutional arrangements that allow and foster the growth of scientific knowledge? Okay, so that said, I will like to talk a little bit, maybe I'll just be very brief about the prevailing neoclassical or mainstream view of the economics of science. And I'm going to use that kind of as a foil and as a jumping off point. But then I'd like to develop some points regarding the contributions of Hayek and Polanyi in this regard. And then at the halfway mark, I will hopefully be ready to talk to you about some historical stuff regarding the actual patterns of government intervention into science. Okay? The upshot of the lecture, perhaps, is contained in the final statement here, which is, well, what are these effects that government does, in fact, have upon science? Okay? And so it kind of fits very nicely, I think, with the previous lecture by Steve in terms of the discussion about central planning of a market system. Here, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there's an analogous issue involved with the central planning of science. Okay? But the difference here is that we're not talking precisely about a market arrangement. We're talking about a different set of institutional arrangements. So being clear about the kinds of institutions that govern science, okay, becomes a really important part of what I want to say today. And I hope as we move along that becomes clearer to you. All right. Neoclassical mainstream economics of science. What's this all about? Well, first of all, it treats science as a market activity. Scientific knowledge, that is treated as just another commodity. The conditions under which that knowledge is generated, according to neoclassical economics, is simply an application of standard microeconomic theory and the there we go. Whoops. Okay, a little bit ahead of myself, but that's all right. I'll leave that up there. But in the neoclassical framework, there is absolutely no institutional detail involved in how they treat the production of scientific knowledge. It's as if the production of scientific knowledge, according to mainstream neoclassical economics, is just kind of like another market out there that we can plug all of our economic micro-theory into, and we can generate results. And by gosh, what do you end up with? Well, you end up with an analysis of a public good issue, because scientific knowledge cannot always be appropriated by its creator. Not always, but it can under certain other conditions. But let's assume that it can't all the time. And when you have this kind of public goods aspect of knowledge, the neoclassical analysis leaps immediately to the argument that we have market failure. Notice how the market aspects of their analysis is used as a lever to make that claim. Science is a market. The production of scientific knowledge is a market. Therefore, it has a public goods issue, and therefore it's market failure, and therefore what? You need government intervention. Okay? That's the neoclassical argument, okay, in a nutshell. And what I'd like to do is argue essentially in what follows is that this analysis really doesn't apply to especially the institutional details that we have to use to understand what science is really about. Now, I know what you're going to ask me, perhaps. Let me anticipate a question that may be bothering you at this point, and that is, well, what is science? And I wish to avoid that particular question because it's a very difficult kind of question. It really is. My basic sense about it, and if I use kind of a working definition of what we can take to be scientific knowledge, it seems to me that it has to have something to do with knowledge that is produced, not necessarily exclusively by individual scientists, but it's a social construction of a lot of people's knowledge, okay, that it is usually codifiable. You can usually write down scientific propositions in a book and publish it, or in papers, or give lectures about it, okay? And it usually has some degree of reliability in terms of explaining the real world, okay? That's a very rough and ready definition. You could probably modify that or even reject it. It wouldn't make a big difference to me, because these things that I've described, reliability, codifiability, really are the kinds of things that scientists themselves claim very often to be or constitute scientific knowledge. And that is the real point I wish to make in this respect, and that is that scientific knowledge is really institutionally determined by the communities that are involved in its production. And for us as outsiders to impose some kind of view as to what is true scientific knowledge is perhaps not giving fair justice to the scientists themselves. So that's kind of maybe a controversial remark, and we can pick it up later, but I didn't want to have you think that I wasn't thinking about these things. Okay. Aside from once we get to the neoclassical approach, I think there are better ways to look at science. And what I'd like to suggest is that there's an Austrian view of science, in quotes, an Austrian view of science that I think is very important. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hayekian Orders, and to do that I'm going to lay some groundwork in terms of what spontaneous orders in general are like and some of their principal characteristics. I'm sure this is kind of treading on ground you've already covered before, but it wouldn't hurt us perhaps just to review it very quickly. The point that I want to emphasize are these right here, the points here. And I prefer looking at science and, quote, spontaneous orders as really emergent orders. Now, what I mean by that is that these orders have the capacity to generate emergent characteristics by the very operation of the order itself. Sometimes I think the word spontaneous often gives people an impression that things appear out of nothing. And for me anyway, the whole issue of emergence is a much more, I think, useful way to approach some of these questions, because we can distinguish various kinds of social orders in terms of the capacities of respective orders and their emergent characteristics to produce those characteristics. So, for example, a market order, which is a particular kind of emergent order, has this unique capacity to produce market prices. Okay? A centrally planned system lacks that capacity. Okay? So we can start distinguishing orders in terms of the kinds of capacities of their ability to produce emergent phenomena. Okay? And we can, as we pass from a catalaxy or the market order into science, the question is, well, what are the specific kinds of things that scientific orders are up to? Okay? So that's one thing I want to cover a little bit in detail as we move on as well. And finally, what I would really want to emphasize is this adaptive aspect of orders. Orders are able to generate emergent characteristics precisely because they are adaptive. That is to say, they are not static. There's no endpoint that you can necessarily specify. Now, you may, through various kinds of interventions, turn what would have been or could have been or was an emergent order into a static, homeostatic result. Hayek has a great term for that. He calls it, you convert a cosmos, which was his later day term for spontaneous order, into a taxis, a centrally planned operation. So you can convert orders that are emergent into things that are not emergent. And of course, the move from a catalaxy or a market order to a centrally planned system is precisely that. Okay? So the whole issue, therefore, is the ability of a scientific order to adapt and to generate scientific knowledge that we find useful. Okay, is not a gimme. It's something that is contingent upon the circumstances or the framework within which that order operates, getting back to a point Kerzner made. Okay? So, I will talk about that, and then finally what I will do is, after the historical analysis, is talk about various ways in which we can start analyzing the effect of government intervention into science from a taxonomy that Thomas McQuaid and I have developed, which tries to sort these issues out by looking at them in terms of the directional effects that government may have on science through its interventions, like the direction of science, do study X versus study Y, the possibility that government intervention may destabilize the scientific order. Okay, and I have lots of examples where I think I can demonstrate that that happens. And finally, and the most important one, is under certain conditions, government intervention can actually distort science, so that you end up in the extreme with a system that is not science at the end of the day. And there's examples of that, of course. Okay. Now, the kind of system we have in America and around the world pretty much now is somewhere in the middle of that, right? It's sort of, we have an interventionist kind of system. Okay. So the extremes that I'm going to point out are historically accurate, but they don't necessarily describe the world we live in, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, the characteristics of spontaneous orders. Okay, let me just read off some things, and if you have questions, please raise them at the Q&A. Self-organizing, unplanned. They're undesigned. They are governed by an implementing set of institutions. Okay, there are certain kinds of institutional arrangements that you need to specify when you look at a particular emergent order. Okay, and those things really do matter. The capacities of these orders to generate knowledge or whatever their outputs is contingent on a variety of different factors. Okay? And lastly, of course, I want to emphasize the adaptive aspects of it. Okay, let me move on now. Okay, I got that, and there we go. And I got that. Oh, I haven't quite talked all about that yet. Okay. To follow this, you have to kind of set aside, thinking of science as a catallaxy. Okay? We're going to use some economics to understand it, of course, but science is not strictly a market kind of arrangement. Now, there are certain aspects of science that do have that aspect. Okay? For example, we often make a distinction between what's called basic science, basic research, applied research, and then research, and then development. Development. So R&D, research and development. And we can break those down into more finely attenuated categories. However, while you may argue, and I would agree with you, that there is a significant aspect of market behavior that is present in the development side of science ordinarily. Now, there's some exceptions to that. Okay? But as we move toward the more basic research side of science, there is the absence, in my judgment, of any kind of underlying catalactic mechanism at work. So that is to say, you don't have prices for basic results of basic research. Okay? Scientists usually cannot sell the results of their basic research. Okay? So you're not talking about a system that is price-driven directly, but rather is governed by something else. Okay? As you slide on the other direction toward development, then the results of that basic research may be applied to various things and then developed for commercial application. Now there, of course, there's an important market aspect to how that all works. So what I want to concentrate on is the basic science side of things largely, and move on from there. Now, the principal institutions, and this is a simplification, certainly, but the principal institutions that I'd like to emphasize about science, especially basic science, is what Thomas and I call the PCR mechanism. Publication, citation, and reputation. Now this draws on a lot of different people's inputs over the years. Sociologist Robert Merton talked about the role of reputation in science. Polanyi talks about it. But this is a way, I think, that we can use this kind of arrangement to kind of, as an organizing principle in understanding from a positive standpoint, what goes on in science. Publication means publishing the results of your research in journals, books, in lectures, on the internet. It's just a catch-all term for the transmission of scientific knowledge to the wider scientific community and beyond. Okay? Citation. Citation is important here because usually, not always, citation means that other scientists have found the results of your research useful in terms of furthering their own research. Now, you're going to say, yeah, that isn't, what about bad citations? Well, Roger, it may have been Leland Yeager that told me once, there's no such thing as a bad citation for your work. That is to say, you're getting recognized even if it's in a negative way. But largely, scientists look for very positive kinds of citations as a way of corroborating their value in producing useful scientific knowledge. Okay? And clearly, if a scientist has accumulated large numbers of citations from within the scientific community or among the peer group in which he or she works, then that says something about the quality and the usefulness of that work. In fact, I noticed on Corey's laptop cover, I'll read it to you, the true test of any scholar's work is not what his contemporaries say, but what happens to his work in the next 25 or 50 years. Well, that's just talking about citations. essentially. The impact that a scientist has upon other scientists in the area. Okay? Okay? What are scientists looking for? Well, reputation. They want to be validated in some sense. Okay? They want to be recognized for their contributions. Okay? Now, they may be motivated by a whole bunch of other things, too. I mean, I could write out a utility function for scientists and say their utility is a function of a whole bunch of different arguments, income, stability, tenure, blah, 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 blah. Sure, that's all part of it, but reputation seems to be a shorthand way of capturing many of those kinds of variables or kinds of inputs into what makes a scientist successful or not. Okay? So reputation is, again, kind of a sort of a catch-all term, but it provides a useful shorthand way to kind of remember what the principal institutions that govern science really perhaps address. So these come in various forms, but it's, again, a shorthand way to look at it. The other major point here, of course, and this is directly related to the PCR mechanism, is that science, in order to be successful, to be able to generate new knowledge, to be a truly emergent kind of order, has to be not only adaptive, but ever-correcting and self-coordinating. So one of the important aspects of the PCR mechanism is in fact the ways in which less useful knowledge is displaced, hopefully most of the time, by more useful knowledge. Okay? So in that sense, there is an error correction mechanism that operates within the institutions of science, and most importantly, is not imposed from outside those institutions. And we'll see in a moment, at the end of the lecture at least, how the modification, the tampering with this kind of mechanism may carry very significant implications for the quality of science in general. Okay, so let me leave that thought with you for the moment and move on. Okay. Okay, I think, let me get back, okay. Now, Hayek, of course, is noted for his work on spontaneous order or emergent orders, and his work, for example, in market theory and in other related areas is obviously foundational to a lot of the things I'm talking about here. But at the same time, we need to recognize that he wasn't necessarily the only guy talking about this stuff back when, in the 1930s. Okay? I guess the first intimation that Hayek was starting to think along these lines occurred in an article in 1933 called The Trend of Economics. And that article was a platform for attacking the German historical school. But it also kind of suggests Hayek's rereading of Menger and discovering anew, that Menger was talking about a kind of an organic process, a spontaneous process. And so these ideas were probably in Hayek's mind from sometime in the early 30s. But Polanyi, to his great credit, was perhaps more astute at this time, at least, in talking about and thinking about what he called, and he coined the term spontaneous order, by the way, because he himself he was a Hungarian national, emigrated to the UK, and as a professional physical chemist. That was his training. He was a chemist, and he got a chaired professorship at, I think, Manchester University as a chemist. And but the kind of mind he has, which was very, just gushing with ideas, I think, he started thinking about the conditions under which science can survive. And now, why was this on his mind at all? Okay? In the course of thinking about it, I might add, he provided a very nuanced, institutionally interesting way of thinking about science. Okay? But what led him to that was things that were going on, not just in the UK, but also to some extent in America as well. And it was called in the UK the social relations of science movement. Now, the social relations of science movement was a collection of mostly scientists, okay, in the UK that had been deeply influenced by central planning as it had occurred in Stalinist Russia. And they argued that the traditional way in which science had been conducted was ignoring the important aspects of science in bettering people's lives. And that they argued that science ought to be redirected more explicitly to dealing with those kinds of issues that directly impact people. Okay? Now, this was a very widespread movement. It filtered into the United States, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the implementation of that agenda involved, in their minds, the necessity for central planning of science. And what I mean by that is that government would take over all funding of science and take over the ways in which those funds would be allocated and the questions that those funds would be used to address. Okay? And this was widely hailed as the next major innovation in the institutions which would govern science. Okay? It's hard to convey the sense, I think, but if you read this history, you'll find that the UK came within a hair of jumping onto the central planning agenda for science. And guess who stopped them? Michael Polanyi. Actually, it was Michael Polanyi and a friend of his called John Baker who formed the Society for Freedom in Science. Okay? And they single-handedly, and I might add Hayek was very much in the shadows at this point, but they almost single-handedly, okay, published papers and had debates with these social relations of science people and stopped in their tracks that kind of agenda. Michael Polanyi saved science from central planning, at least in the UK. Okay? And it's a great accomplishment, and it testifies to not only the cogency of his arguments, but also to the voraciousness, the perseverance of this guy to continue a fight almost single-handedly against literally overwhelming odds, both within his own scientific community as well as in the prevailing political class.
What was the name of the fellow that he did this with?
John Baker. Okay. Now, what Polanyi argues is, and I'll just be very short here. I don't want to. We can get sidetracked in these things easily, as you can see. But Polanyi argued that if you want to have science, and he thought of science as the discovery of truth. And he said, if you want to have science, you have to have freedom. And why do you need freedom? Well, because science is the process by which you discover the truth. And unless you have the freedom to pursue questions, you won't discover truth. You need that kind of freedom to get to the boundaries of knowledge and extend those boundaries. If you are not free, if someone's telling you what the questions are, if someone is telling you what you need to do, then that is fundamentally contrary to what science is really all about. Okay? So his argument against central planning was that you cannot have science with central planning. You will kill science with central planning of science. Okay? Very powerful argument. Okay? And he hammered and hammered away at this, eventually winning the day. But I must say, he won the day, but it wasn't a complete victory. And part of the problem, and what part of the explanation for the fact that it was not a complete victory was, while it is true central planning was not pursued by the UK except during the war years, which Polanyi supported, by the way. Okay? But he never quite got the connection or the implications associated with government funding and the effects it may have on science. So he was adamantly against central planning in science, but he was all in favor of government funding of science. And I think he won the battle, but I think he conceded a bit too much and may have lost the long-run war. Okay? So I have great admiration for Polanyi, obviously, but I think he could have made his case a little bit more enduring and less problematic, as we will see. Okay. Now, I might add, I'll save my comment on Hayek till later about this particular episode, but what I want to do now is kind of say, okay, we didn't have central planning in the UK of science. It never happened in the United States, pretty much, but we have had, since World War II, a progressive increase of the presence of government in science. So as I said earlier, we're kind of in this interventionist middling ground, and yet there are still problems that we must consider in this respect as well. Let me give you a little bit of a historical overview of America in terms of government funding of science. And this is from ASS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. What this chart shows you, of course, is a couple of interesting things. Number one, the magnitude in real dollars of the increase in government funding of science has gone 17-fold since the end of World War II. Okay? Notice, interestingly, the lighter colored bars indicate defense R&D. Okay? So we're capturing here all kinds of research and development expenditures. And you can see that one of the important drivers of government involvement in science has to do with wars, defense, that sort of thing. And the amount of non-defense R&D funding has been a roughly stable proportion of that, roughly, over the course of that time. Okay? So one of the drivers you can conclude from this for government funding in science is precisely related to defense. And you probably want to read Bob Higgs on how that all happens. Okay? Now, this is another chart that shows you U.S. R&D funding in billions of constant dollars by the source of the funding. And what do you notice here? That the federal government, at least in America, is roughly about a third, roughly, of overall R&D expenditures. Okay? Now, let me keep that in mind. Let me flip to the next one here, if I've got the right chart up. Yeah. At the same time, given that one that I just showed you, most of the basic research of science remains funded by the federal government. Okay? So that means that while overall all R&D research is dominated by private funding, okay, the basic science is about 80% funded by government. Okay? And that's important to remember, it seems to me. Okay? The other sources, by the way, other than industry, would be foundations, private monies, donors, and that sort of thing. And also, in some cases, that would also capture the funding that originates within academic institutions through other endowments and tuition, what have you. Okay. Now, this chart here is meant to reflect upon the fact that the people who benefit from all of this government monies directed at R&D are, guess who? Universities. And this leads us to an important point. If you want to think in terms of public choice issues here, you can think of the government as a funder, and you can think of its clients, all right? And the clients pretty much are universities, the presidents of universities, the faculties of universities, all with their hands out petitioning government for more money. Okay? Also, include on that. You have to think about the other kinds of clients, like the Defense Department and other agencies within government itself. Okay? FFRD refers to federally funded research and development centers. Okay? Los Alamos is a jet propulsion labs, that kind of thing. Okay? So the government directly operates and funds government-run laboratories a lot too. Okay? Now, how did we get to this point in time? How did we get here? Well, we've had government intervention in America since the first days of the Republic. You know, Lewis and Clark, it was a government-funded project. And there was a lot of little stuff like that was going on. But probably the biggest impetus for an increased presence of government funding occurs sometime around the Civil War. Again, the connection between federal funding of science and war is very palpable. Okay? The funds were allocated for all kinds of things during the war. New technologies were developed and counted for a significant impact upon the kind of science that was done. Also, the establishment of the land-grant universities in the 19th century was also a kind of an important event because the land-grant universities were charged, were obviously state-established institutions, right? And were charged with doing a variety of things, including research. A lot of agricultural research or engineering kinds of research, okay, that kind of stuff. And that just exploded, as you can well imagine, over the years as these universities expanded and justified these increased funds on the basis of, gee, we've got to educate thousands and thousands of more students. And we need professors to do that. We need professors to research. So a lot of factors were playing into the emergence of a fairly robust presence of government in the United States throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, mainly driven by the Civil War, World War I, and after those conflicts ended, usually the funding stopped pretty much. Okay? So it wasn't a policy that was developed at this time to ensure government funding of science. Rather, it was perceived necessities. Okay? Whether those perceptions were correct or not is not my issue, but they were transitory kinds of interventions largely. Okay? This changed with the Great Depression, and it changed with the great boogeyman of libertarians, FDR. Okay? And in this case, he deserves that moniker, I guess, because he was, and his think tank in the administration were apparently pretty seriously influenced by the social relations of science movement that had arisen in the UK. Okay? So the argument for expanding government intervention into science was, gee, we've got to make the United States better. We've got to figure out ways to improve the standard of living because, gee, we're in a deep depression, and that, of course, was not our fault. Okay? But we've got to do something about it. Okay? So there was lots of things that were generated during the mid-1930s and into the pre-war years that resulted in the creation of institutions within government that were charged with the responsibility of assessing and promoting and advising the administration on how to best increase and use government funding of science. Okay? Now, again, once the war came, of course, that just took precedence over everything in the 40s. But even so, the FDR approach and the things he put into place had a different kind of quality than had occurred previously, because he charged his people with not just figuring out ways to produce good R&D for the war effort, but producing good R&D for the post-war effort. So FDR was very facile in thinking in terms of a permanent presence of government and science after the cessation of hostilities. Okay? And what happened at this point was a huge debate erupted in the Congress, which pitted one group, who I will call the New Dealers, against a more modern kind of conception of science by another group, and I'll be more specific. The New Dealers, and one senator in particular, Senator Kilgore from West Virginia. West Virginia has this capacity of producing weird senators. Kilgore, Byrd, and but in any case, he wanted and had a coalition of some important associates in the Congress in calling for the central direction of science by government. Okay, and he introduced one bill after another into the Congress to make that all happen, but he was opposed by another group of people led by not a political personality, but an administrator in the FDR's administration, by the guy named of Bush, Vannevar Bush. No relation to G.W., I don't think. Vannevar Bush was a scientist out of MIT, Carnegie institutions, and he said, no, central planning really doesn't work. Okay, we don't want to go that route. What we need instead is just to simply fund science and let the scientific community kind of figure it out, and that's the route we ought to go. So kind of a decentralized approach to government funding. And he published a very important book in 1945 called The Science, the Endless Frontier. And that was kind of the tipping point that led to what we now have as the interventionist system in place. Okay, so Vannevar Bush's vision prevailed as opposed to the central planners, but again, it was a fairly shallow victory in my estimation. Just like Polanyi, he wanted to have good science, but he thought you could only get it with a lot of government funding. Okay. So, how do we imagine all of this government funding? What's the problem with it? Well, I like to think of it in terms of analyzing the effects of government funding of science according to what I call the 3 Ds. Directional problems, destabilization problems, and distortion problems. Okay? Now, what makes government intervention or funding of science so relevant is that government in this case is what has been called by others a big player. Roger Koppel and again Leland Yeager had developed some of the underlying theory for this, and I recommend you Google Koppel and Yeager and come up with some of the papers that they wrote on this stuff. But government is a big player, which means that the government can kind of insinuate itself into a situation and kind of control the situation. Okay? In the case of the original work done by Koppel and Yeager, they used the concept to describe government intervention into the market economy. In that case, their application required that not only would government be the big player, the big, the 300-pound gorilla in the living room, but also was exempt itself from the discipline of the market. Okay? Well, so too in science. Once you are a big player in science, you can kind of play with the rules a little bit maybe and determine things in ways that would not have come about had the system been more decentralized or absent these kinds of big players. Now, this is a point that Hayek in the Constitution of Liberty was apparently quite well aware of. And when he talks about science near the end of the Constitution of Liberty, he talks about science as pushing the boundaries of knowledge and all of that. Kind of a very Polanyi discourse he gives, actually, without attribution, as I recall. But at the same time, he says it's very important that the sources of funding which control who gets what resources in science be as highly dispersed and decentralized as possible. He said the big problem in science is if you have people that, or funders that are just too big. Okay, so he was kind of advancing in a sort of way this big player argument itself, and I don't think people have appreciated those remarks of his as much as they should. In any case, what's the problem here? Well, if you're the big player, and this applies to government or any private big player. I mean, I'm not going to make a distinction here. If you were the Rockefeller Institute, right, got billions of dollars in endowment, and you can funnel those monies in particular ways, well, then you can determine certain things about what kind of science is done. Okay? So this is a generalized argument about government and any other big player, for that matter. But in the case of government as a big player, we get some additional things that don't apply to private big players, if you will. And that, among those things, would be the politicization of science, and almost as a necessary aspect of the kind of science that's done, in terms of directing the flow of funds towards specific kinds of questions that the political class or the funders wish scientists to pursue. Okay? It follows night like day, right? If you're paying somebody to do X, you want them to do X, not something else. Okay? So what you have is a system in place in which the government, being the predominant funder of at least basic science, okay, comes up with agendas, comes up with objectives, criteria for what kind of science is going to be done. Okay? Now, is this bad science? No, not necessarily at all. Okay? Not necessarily. If you're funding scientists to, let's say, investigate the carbon monoxide effects of pig dung, okay, in Oklahoma, okay, as long as your science is reputable, and as long as you are operating within that PCR mechanism that I described, it doesn't mean your results will be correct, of course, but it does mean you're playing by the perceived rules of the game that apply to scientific investigations. So the funding of science is, even if it's for ridiculous kinds of research problems, as long as it confines itself to operating within the prevailing and evolved institutions of science, will be subject to the same kinds of criteria that any other kind of science is subject to. And the error correction mechanisms will, of course, kick in. And if the science is not good, there'll be people who will maybe pick up this thread and find counter-evidence or counterfactual evidence to dispute your claims. Okay, so the fact that you can direct the way in which science addresses questions does not imply, I should say, that the science is any the less scientific. But what it does mean is that if you're a big player, you can make the determination of, let's research global warming and let's not research, let's say, lung cancer, which is a very apt, actually correct observation on how funds are usually directed. If you look at the funding profile for cancer research, does anyone in the audience know which is has the biggest claim on those funds? Which? Breast cancer. Okay. The other major impact of government funding on the National Institutes of Health is on AIDS and HIV-related problems. Okay? Lung cancer, for example, gets a very small portion of those funds. Very small. Okay? And the argument, of course, that is made, and quite erroneously it seems, is that, well, if people get lung cancer, it's their own damn fault. They should have been smoking anyway. Okay? Well, that's not true. A significant portion of lung cancer patients never smoked a thing in their life, apparently. But anyway, the ways in which science is conducted is a matter of political discretion and has little to do with other objectives as such. Okay. Now, I've already talked about the clients of how these funding occurs, and that's like a big black box in some ways. I mean, it's just like a big mess. That's what I really mean. It's like a big mess. All the goings on in between Congress and the lobbyists, the administration is mind-boggling. When GW was president, he wasn't really in favor of global warming research very much. You know, he would give a few billion here and there, of course, but what he did was divert funds from the National Science Foundation from global warming research to outer space, galactic research. No, seriously. Okay? And that was his way of funding science and satisfying certain interests of the scientific community, but without kind of caving in to the environmentalists as much. You know, Obama's changed all that. If you look at his budget, the 2010, which is a no, it's not. You're anticipating, I think, the wrong thing. I've checked his budget very closely, and I look at data that I get from the National Science Foundation and other government institutions on the amounts of funding for various categories, and they simply cannot be reconciled with the things that the Obama budget says have been doing. The numbers there's something wrong with all of their numbers. I don't know who's at fault, but the numbers cannot be reconciled. But one thing I do know is that the stimulus package of last February increased scientific funding enormously. Okay, that's one thing that I do know, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway. So this is the directional effects here that I like to think about. And I have a whole bunch of possible examples. Let me just pick the hydrogen car one. Just to, under George Bush, they authorized a couple $1 billion for hydrogen car research. Okay, and they estimated, National Academy of Sciences estimated it would require about $200 billion eventually to get it right. So a lot of funds have been directed toward that. Now, I know 1.2 billion, it seems like a drop in the bucket these days. And I've often wondered, after the events of this past year, and we're talking about maybe $200 billion of government funding of research, that seems like nothing these days, right? I've wondered about that, but I do think the impacts are not fully disclosed by the relative smallness of the numbers here. But in any case, a lot of money has been directed toward this, and that promoted a lot of research. Okay, but as we'll see in just the next slide, there was a problem here. Okay, and I'll pick that up in a minute. This was McCain during candidate McCain's aborted candidacy for president. He was personally going to offer $300 million of your money for a new kind of new generation car battery. All right. Another example for you computer people out there. Japan in the 80s was going to develop this, what they called the 5th generation computer. This is going to be like the super computer. Japan's doing it and allocating hundreds of millions of dollars toward this. The UK said, hey, we can't be last guy in the block. We've got to do it. Germany had to do it. We got into the act. And at the end of the day, billions of dollars were allocated toward this so-called 5th generation computer research. Of course, what came of it? Nothing. Just nothing. It was abandoned because it didn't work out as they had hoped. In any case, those are examples of how the government can direct research. All right. I'm going to skip this slide. That was just academic earmarking funds, but I want to move on to destabilizing effects. This is a little bit more interesting and problematic. Interesting because it's when government if you buy into the idea that government funding of science is politically driven in a substantial sort of way, then it means that as the political agenda changes, so too ought the directional aspects of how the funds are allocated, right? Okay, and that's exactly what you find. I gave you an example of Bush and Obama on galactic versus environmental research. But this is kind of an interesting thing because it speaks to boom and bust. You allocate a lot of funds to X question, and boy, scientists are attracted to it. They get new labs, they get new graduate students, and they're all gung-ho, and then suddenly the political winds change, so 2 years later the funds dry up. What happens? You have a bust. What do? They have to switch research programs. So you have like a boom-bust episodic kind of problem going on that arises out of the political process by which government funding is made. Okay? This is very hard. I said it's very challenging because it's very hard to pick up the data on this stuff. You can track certain categories of government funding data, but the real payoff is in knowing more precisely, at kind of like the micro level, what kinds of research projects are in fact being funded. Okay? Now NSF, which is a small player in this, the National Institutes of Health, for example, far outstrip in funding the NSF. But if you can find data from NSF that lists all of their funding proposals that they've accepted, and you can kind of figure out what those funds are being used for. Well, they issue about 20,000 funding proposals a year. So I need a graduate student to help me sort through that stuff. And if you're interested in doing that, I'd be happy to welcome you aboard. Seriously, and it's a major empirical question that needs to be resolved in terms of tracking these kinds of destabilizing effects. Okay? Now we know they exist, okay, because we can follow certain episodes, but we can get case studies, but it's not clear if we want to make a more general point ultimately, I guess, about this. But getting back to the hydrogen cars, all this money was funded toward hydrogen cars. Not many results of any value seem to come out of it, but then just, I guess, last week, 2 weeks ago, the Energy Secretary, testifying before Congress, says, I don't want to fund this stuff anymore because it's useless. We're never going to get to the objective that is promised with the use of hydrogen cars. And he gave a very cogent argument. He said the infrastructure that would be required to make this sort of economically feasible is way, way beyond our funding capabilities. There's got to be better ways. Now, if he had his druthers, that means all of that research that had been directed toward hydrogen stuff and was sustaining research communities across the country were now going to lose their funding. And what do? So again, you have these destabilizing kinds of events going on, and they seem to operate very clearly at certain micro level instances. Now I'm going to just briefly announce that I'm predicting. Austrian economists are never supposed to predict things. I'm predicting that there, in fact, is going to be a green bubble. Okay, and the basis for that remark, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I'm more and more convinced that as the Obama's administration gets ensconced and in various adventuresome kinds of things that it has a propensity, it seems to do, we're going to see a lot more activity in this area that will generate kind of a scientific bubble. And the question is, if the science is not correct or if it's somehow distorted or not quite right, that bubble will have to eventually collapse. That scientific bubble will have to collapse. Okay, and that's what I'm predicting. I think we're going to go through a period where we're going to have a lot of activity in this area, a lot of funding, and a lot of shenanigans. I mean, after all, GM is going to be pumping out these green little cars, right? We're going to enter into that kind of world, I think, pretty quickly. But let me move on. That's. I'm running out of time, I think, so I'll just. That was a repeat of that one. Okay. If you want any of this stuff, I'll post it for you, including my lecture notes and the whole thing here. But this is more important stuff right now than the other charts I was about to show you, and that is it possible for government to actually distort science? Again, in each of these cases of directional effects and destabilizing effects, whatever science is being produced is either correct, or in some sense correct, or the scientists themselves will, over the long run, correct it. All right? So if we move into a world in which all of the funding, a great deal of funding is going toward climate change, okay, eventually you have to accept the fact that unless something badly goes wrong in what we take to be the legitimate purview of scientists in terms of their business, what they do, okay, that if the science isn't there, we'll eventually learn that. We'll eventually learn that. The truth will be revealed, in a sense, at some point in the future. But the problem is, what happens if the government has a way of distorting the procedures that we use and institutions that govern what we take to be science? That's a different question altogether. Okay?
Didn't they, for a while, require maximum dose testing, for instance?
I'll get to your questions later. Okay? When you have a distortion in what is taken to be scientific knowledge, and again, I'm using my PCR mechanism to kind of, as our analytical principle to kind of talk about this. When you do something that alters those institutions of science, what do you end up with? You end up with quasi-science, and you end up with science by other means, which means you don't have science at all. Okay? Now I'm going to give you some examples of this. So if it's not quite clear at this point, I hope it will be more clear as we move on. Okay? The first case study I'd like to just briefly mention is what's called Lysenkoism in Stalinist Russia. Okay. Now, Stalin had a problem. I mean, a lot of problems. But one of his problems was, due to the collectivization of farms, they couldn't produce enough food. People were starving. And there was, as you know, in the Ukraine, well, I guess the estimates are somewhere around 30 million people starved to death because the food was taken from the Ukraine and shipped elsewhere, that kind of thing. Well, Stalin, all the same, was still interested in figuring out ways he could produce scientific agricultural output. And it turned out that there was a charlatan, a guy named Lysenko, who had insinuated himself into the party structure and got the ear of Stalin. And he said, I have a way of ensuring that you will be able to double agricultural output very quickly. His way was this kind of bizarre grafting procedure that he came up with that was in effect a rejection of Mendel's genetic theory. Now, up until this point, genetic research in Russia was, like everywhere else in Western Europe, really good. It was reputable. But Lysenko had this different, actually very unscientific proposition that he was able to get Stalin to sign on to. Okay? And Lysenko was put in charge of agricultural research. Okay? And of course, the biologists, the geneticists, were up in arms. They said, no, this stuff is ridiculous. You have no credentials, you didn't study formally this stuff, and your ideas have been known to be false. How do you think Lysenko dealt with these people? Gulags, some of them were killed. Okay? What the upshot is that because of the ties between Lysenko's ideas and the political powers in place, he was able to dominate the science and to use it in a way that bypassed all kinds of convention, traditional precepts of what good science was. Okay? What was the result of genetic and biological and agricultural research in Russia? It evaporated, and it never really recovered. Never. Maybe recently they've learned some mistakes of the past, but for decades the legacy of Lysenkoism was the destruction of Soviet biological science, the destruction of it. Okay? And the way they did it was by altering the PCR mechanism. No longer was scientific propositions adjudicated by the considered work of scientists in the area, but now was adjudicated by political principles. Okay? That's not a good way to run science. Next, I'll give you one other example. I don't know what the time is. How am I doing on time? A few minutes? 5 minutes to what? Okay, I have Q&A time? Okay. Maybe I'll skip this and just cut to the chase then, okay? There's a couple of interesting case studies that I've written about that you can access, and these concern how the combination of regulatory oversight derived from the funding by government of science led, in this case, to I'll talk about a little bit, I guess, to David Baltimore's hauling before a subcommittee in Congress back some years, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And he acknowledged that his scientific research was subject to error. And the committee equated error with some kind of fraud. So he was accused of fraudulent science. And what they did was systematically attack his reputation as a scientist. It happened to be the case that Baltimore, just as a footnote here, it's an important footnote, was the president of the academic president of the Rockefeller Institute, was a Nobel winner in cellular research. And here he is pulled before these congressmen in Congress who knew no science, and his reputation was totally destroyed. Okay? So that's the way in which a regulatory oversight can affect the reputation of scientists and thereby nullify or diminish their prestige within their own communities. Okay? The government dietary outlines, that's a longer story. I'm going to pass on that. It's a sad tale, I might add, and not a very happy one for most of us, but I'm going to close with this repeat of Obama's message, and I hope in what I've said now kind of resonates with you in terms of understanding the danger that's implicit in Obama's statement here. Okay? If you really want to have a viable scientific community in anything, in this case, like say global climate research, you've got to reject the top-down central planner vision that this represents. You know, I mean, who is this guy to tell us that the science is settled? Who is he to tell us, or not us, I mean scientists, that the facts are clear? Okay, so this has gone unchallenged except for the petition that I've noted to you, and I like to finish now with this. The Polanyi and the Austrians won the battle, but they may have lost the war over certain aspects of central planning and science. There is a rationale for the effect of science brought about by government funding through all kinds of different vehicles, from the funding itself to the selection of the funding to the regulatory oversight to the public relations and announcements that come out of Washington about science on a daily basis, it seems now. I guess when Mario talks about paternalism, I guess it's later today or tomorrow, the new paternalism is very much about telling you what you can or cannot eat. You know, in New York, for example, the city council banned foods made with trans fats, for example. There's movements afoot to ban the importation of raw milk cheeses from France because it's not good for you. And you have to be told what's good. They've got the science. You don't count. Okay. And then the last point I want to make is simply this is a really wide open field for research, and I was only half kidding before when I said I could really use some good graduate students and students interested in exploring these kinds of questions, because it really is an untapped area, I think, for Austrian economists. So I want to leave you with that little dangling pearl, perhaps, not really a pearl, a gumdrop. And you know, it's just fun stuff to do, and it combines nice kinds of theoretical apparatus with some the need for good empirical work. So I'll leave it at that and take some questions. Yes, I'll take Igor. Speak up so everybody can hear you, please.
So do you feel that the government has a role in providing funding for scientific projects which have a social utility but don't have market for investment? Now I can throw a few things out at you, such as the U.S. Geological Survey, the volcano and earthquake tornado monitoring, atmospheric and oceanic research, cosmic monitoring of near-Earth objects and solar flares, and in particular the Center for Disease Control.
Okay, so Igor's question, did you all hear it? No, some people in the back did not. It was essentially, aren't there specific instances where you do really need government funding in order to ensure that certain kinds of research are undertaken? Okay, and the examples that were given were volcanic research and other things like that. Well, to answer your question, I haven't made that argument here, and I'm not sure I would be prepared to make that argument at this point in my research. Okay, rather, what I do think is necessary is that we are aware that from whatever presumed benefits the undertaking and government funding of such kinds of projects may generate, that we have to at least consider those things in terms of the so-called costs associated with that kind of funding. So I'm not quite suggesting we need a hardcore neoclassical cost-benefit analysis. What I am suggesting, though, is that to simply point out that, gee, we haven't got somebody exploring Mars this year, may for some scientists be oh my God, how can we go on unless we know about that stuff? At the same time, there are other issues involved that may kind of assuage the perceived significance of those kinds of research undertakings. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't want to make a global argument at this point that we should have no government funding of science. I think there may well be some instances where it may be quite important. I'm not making that argument, though. The other point I'd like to make is the issue of whether you can have government funding of basic science, which is what you're talking about, science with no perceptible commercial application, at least in the immediate run, would not be undertaken by private funders. That's the premise you're working from, that there is some sort of problem in securing that kind of funding. Well, think about this, if you mind. Basic research leads to applied research, leads to development, and maybe commercial application. Okay? And this is usually the direction in which we assume the process works. You do your basic research, you figure out ways that you can apply it, and then you try to develop it, and in this case, your case, with the, say, exploration of Mars, you get the right rocket ships in place, and blah, 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 and you have maybe a commercial application at the end of the day. Maybe not. Here's the problem with that argument, and it matters for your question because it turns out that these are really bidirectional arrows, in fact. That is to say, the old argument that it's basic research that is the fountainhead for all new developments in science is just not correct. In other words, when scientists are trying to develop or apply technologies, even at the commercial end of things, okay, in many, many cases, they are forced to reconsider the underlying science itself. So that in this case, there is a lot of basic science that's performed by private funders and industry that is mainly interested in some sort of commercial application, but in the process of doing that, they also have to figure out the basic science. Okay, so the question is, yeah, you can always list have a list of things that maybe private industry wouldn't do. Okay, but on the other hand, I don't think you can leap to the conclusion that there would be this kind of collapse in basic research if it were no government funding. Yeah, so I'm not sure where in the middle and how where you want to position yourself on that. I'm not sure where I position myself on that, but I do know that the scientific community is a lot more complex than simply getting scientists in their labs, in their ivory towers, and then at the end of a couple of years they haven't applied something that can apply.
Well, I guess in this case, it's mostly things which I feel are kind of disaster prevention. It's more in the sense of defense rather than application for, commercial.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but even if it is, I mean, no matter which way, you need to consider the fact that maybe the reason why industry doesn't do more basic research is precisely because they can free ride on government research. So there's a whole bunch of issues here, right, that have to be kind of sorted out, and I don't think that the tools that are available to us from neoclassical economics are particularly helpful in this respect. I do think that if we adopt a more Austrian-sensitive approach, I think we can get a better picture of some of the problems and some of the possible solutions here. Let me get somebody way in the back there. Yes, Miss?
Okay, I'm wondering a little bit, you didn't really touch on it, but I'm wondering what the effects of government funding in science has on the distribution of knowledge and the permutation of knowledge throughout the world. Could you touch on that? I'm just wondering your opinion.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, I think. Let me address it this way, okay? Maybe it's not going to be a full answer, but it's an issue that a lot of people are concerned about, and that is most government science funding for basic research is conducted on the basis of peer review proposals, right? So in this case, when NSF gets a proposal for some scientific project, they send it out to experts in the area, and they advise then NSF to fund it or not. By the way, that whole process of peer reviewing of government funding arose during World War II. And prior to that time, there was one guy in the Office of Scientific Research, this is no lie, one guy in the Office of Scientific Research who pretty much determined which government projects for science funding were going to get funded or not. And then he started asking around when the flood of wartime needs really ballooned. He couldn't handle it himself, so he enlisted other people to do the reviewing. That's how government peer reviewing got started. But what's the problem with that? You say, gee, you have experts in your field reviewing your proposal. Isn't that a good thing? Maybe, maybe not. Why? some evidence exists for people who have looked into this fairly closely that it tends to promote an old boys network, that it's only proposals that are accepted are those which conform to the mainstream orthodoxy in the prevailing view of that particular science. And it tends, therefore, to run the risk of, in fact, collapsing science and as opposed to exploring and extending the boundaries of science. So there may be some issues there. I'm not sure what a better, I don't have a plan for a better way of reviewing proposals, except not maybe to fund them. But that's my opinion only. But it's a big problem, and I think as we'll see in, like, say, global climate research, two things are happening. I mean, this is apocryphal information. It's very, very hard to get hardcore data on this stuff. But you hear a lot of scientists talking kind of, in the quiet halls of academia about if you want to submit a proposal on climate research, you better have a proposal that at least states the conclusion that the government is looking for. And in that sense, there's an implicit imposition of a collapse of what we would call real science. Those are just two examples. I don't know if that answers your question fully or sort of.
Yeah.
Yes, Adam, yes.
I was wondering, do you think that the situation with the Austrian economics now in the field of economics is a consequence of this governmental funding into economic research, or maybe it's just a lock-in historical situation?
No.
And also, do you think that governmental funding influences differently natural sciences versus social sciences, because the implications from the social sciences might impact bigger political environment?
Yeah, a good question. If I can repeat the question, what is the potential impact of government funding on economic research, and does it matter for the results if funding is directed towards hardcore science versus social science? Two good questions. Let me take the last one first. I really do think the error correction mechanisms that apply to science in the narrow sense are probably more well established than the error correction mechanisms that we find in the social sciences. What I mean by that is, I don't want you to think that I've got some kind of little globe I look in for the truth. Okay, quite the contrary, in fact. Rather, I'm suggesting that in science, if you have a scientific claim that is empirically verifiable in some level, and if it doesn't work, you're going to find out real quick. If you're proposing an economic policy that this is the way to go, we're dealing with a different situation, a different set of phenomena, where even the detection of error in your science may be very difficult to establish. So there's, for that reason, I think the dangers of government funding of social sciences or the humanities is far more tenuous and ought to be easily rejected first, even before we start talking about hard science. Now, does the first question was the
Austrian economics,
yes, yeah, right. That's a very interesting question, and there's let me just answer it in the following way. All of you who are in graduate school economics are going to have to take an econometrics course, right? At one point or another. When I was in graduate school in the 70s, can I admit to that? I had to take 3 econometrics courses because it was a new field. No one really knew what it was doing, kind of. How did that happen? How did it happen that econometrics suddenly became the de rigueur, right? Well, part of the story was in an institute called the Cowles Foundation. And that was a privately funded thing. And they pushed and pushed and pushed this kind of agenda and enlisted the assistance of very good economists like Tobin and other people to push this econometric agenda. And that got really established. The other instance I will mention here is You look at all the research, economic research that's funded through the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve banks. Okay? Each Federal Reserve Bank has its own research division. Now, some of them are more independent than others, but this is all government research. Okay? Now, the Fed earns money on its securities that it holds, all right, lots of money. And how do they spend that money? They spend it on research, they spend it on tennis courts, airplanes, they build new buildings for themselves, swimming pools, thick carpets, and all the rest. But that's also a lot of research that goes into the monies that the Fed earns on holding of government securities. And I think that makes an important difference. That's a big, big story. I could talk more about it, but I think you get the gist of my remarks. Is that fair enough?